Hi everybody. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to walk through this tutorial page that I have. It's more like a demo because we're not actually going to be adding anything to the document. I'm only going to be showing you the code that is in here and how it will affect the page. So the way that this is set up is that I have created a HTML document, which is the Flexbox tutorial HTML file. This is part of a download that you can get off of Canvas. And inside of this document, I have a linked CSS file called flexboxstyles.css. Now over here on the right hand side, what you are seeing is the HTML document with some basic CSS added to it, but nothing that is Flexbox specific is showing at this point in time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be going through the CSS document and taking the comments off of CSS properties and values that I've already pre-added. So they're in here, it's just that they're kind of like, they're turned off for right now. So we're going to go through and kind of turn them on, look at what the effect is on the HTML document in live view so we can get to understand a little bit more about how Flexbox might be working. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do this, and then of course I would love for you to experiment with this on your own. So all of this is available on Canvas for you. I'm going to go ahead and just minimize a few things on my screen because my interface is pretty small because I'm working on my laptop, so I don't have a lot of screen space to be able to work with. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so back again into our HTML and CSS document. Let's go ahead and start off over in the CSS. So what I've got in here is a CSS selector that is likely very unfamiliar to you. So this is a grouped selector, we can tell because it has commas inside of it. And it is focusing on three things. So the asterisk colon before, and the asterisk colon after. We've seen like a slightly similar pseudo element before when we were clearing the floats when we were working on float-based layouts. However, this one is a little bit different than that because this is talking about the universal selector. That's what the asterisk means. It means that it selects every single element that possibly could exist in your HTML document. And then it's also saying anything that came before that and anything that comes after one of those selectors. It's a little bit confusing, but feel free to do a little web search if you'd like to learn more about what the universal selector is. Now, this is actually a selector that we will have to have in any of the documents that you are going to be using with Flexbox. And the reason for why we would need to have this is because what we have to do is we need to set the box sizing to something called border box. Now this is not the default box model. I have a separate posting for you on the box model and the difference between content box and border box. Content box is the default box model that we have been using because we haven't specified anything else. Now, since layout technologies have improved, which we've kind of talked about in class, that Flexbox is kind of a newer layout technology, they also had to add in some new CSS properties in order to support it. Now, the box sizing of border box, again, is something that we are going to want to set up as a CSS rule for any document that we plan to use Flexbox in, or I would say responsive layouts, or I would say grids, or a bunch of other kind of newer technologies. So I want everybody to put this specific CSS rule into all of their CSS documents going forward. Okay, and you can put that right up there at the top as kind of like a default site-wide CSS rule. So I've got a little comment in here about what the box sizing border box is. Please go ahead and read it. Now below that, we see that our next rule is targeting the element with the ID of container. And that happens to be our div, which is the box that's holding all of these things together in our HTML document. And of course, we've given it a width in here, and I've given it some margins to center it within the browser window. Now, the next section of CSS that we have in here starts with another comment, and I'm saying in here that I'm starting the code for the navigation bar. So here's my navigation bar up here. And in the past, we've been using display inline block as the way to get our list items into a horizontal column or into a horizontal row. But we're going to try using Flexbox today so you can see how you might be able to use your CSS and Flexbox to get a very similar look, but with maybe a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more ease. So in here, we have the nav element. The nav element actually has a background color that is a green, and we're seeing that in here right now. I have different colors in here so that we can kind of visualize where the different elements are sitting. Now after this, we have the nav UL, which means that we're targeting the unordered list when it is inside of nav. Now, we've got a couple of things in here already, like I've taken the padding off on the left so that they are not going to be indented, right? If I were to comment this out so that it wasn't in use, let me go ahead and put a comment on it. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can put a comment in here. So if I were to come in here and I did / asterisk, and then at the end I went in here asterisk *, then what we would see is that there is actually an indentation set up on the unordered list, which is pushing all of our list items, which are the children of the unordered list, off to the right-hand side. And what we're seeing behind this in here is actually the nav. So this green color right here is actually the nav color. I'm going to go ahead and take that off, and so we will outdent again and be flush left. There we go. Okay, so I've also removed the bullets, and I have dealt a little bit with some of the other values in here. So the first CSS property and value that we're coming into in here that has been commented out is that we have a height value on our list items. Now, I put in here that I generally do not add height values because it can cause vertical alignment issues. So content within inside of those boxes can sometimes have a hard time aligning vertically. But with Flexbox, we can easily deal with vertical alignment. So we can even use heights when using Flexbox. So I'm going to go ahead and take this comment off. And so the way that I'm going to do that is I am selecting the beginning of the comment. And then I'm going to go ahead and actually what I'm going to do with this one, so I can keep the actual comment, the conversation part to you in a comment, I'm going to take that comment tag, I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to go back and grab it, and I'm going to move it over to right before I have the word note. So it's like I'm only taking a portion of that content out of the comment. I'm just sort of moving the start of the comment down the line a little bit. So now what we can see in here is that we actually have a 40 pixel high unordered list. And you can see that blog now no longer fits inside of there because those 4 list items together take up more vertical space than 40 pixels. And this bar that we're seeing now, the green bar, is been shrunk down to be 40 pixels. So anything that's taller is going to spill out the bottom. It's not going to stay like that. It's just a temporary issue. Okay, so continuing on with properties and values for the unordered list in here, I have some new flex properties in here. So we're going to go ahead and try these right now. So the first one is that we are applying the display of flex to the parent. So the parent is the unordered list, okay? That's the green space that we see in here. The list items themselves are the children. When we work with Flexbox, we actually first start by telling whatever parent element that we have to display as flex. Therefore, all of their children will immediately come in and be flex items. So I'm going to go ahead and take my opening comment and I'm going to grab it and I'm going to drag it down the line in here. And now all of a sudden I have displayed flex for the unordered list in the navigation. And you can see that what has happened here is that all of my list items have moved in line with one another. And this is the rest of the nav element in here, which has that lime green color in the background. Now, clearly this is not what we want because yes, they're sitting next to each other, but they're all smushed up next to each other. They don't have their own space. So let's continue on. Now, the next one in here is specifying the direction of the flex content in here. Now, the thing about this is that we don't actually ever have to say that the flex direction is going to be in a row just because that is the default. So if we really want things to flex out or sit next to each other and share space in a horizontal space, that is the default. So we don't actually have to put this in here. Some of the alternatives in here are things like we could put them in row reverse, which would put things like blog at the beginning. Let's go ahead and try that. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to bring it in here and I'm just going to go ahead and paste right over. And now what we see is not only did all of the list items flip-flop in order, actually moved the entire unit of list items off to the right-hand side too. So maybe you can find a use case for that, but at this point, we're just going to go ahead and keep this as row. So I'm going to delete row reverse in here and I'm back to row. There's some others in here too, like column, which is what we started off with the list items stacking on top of each other, and then column reverse. None of those are what we want, right? Okay, let's go ahead and talk about other things we want to have happen to our list items. We're going to turn on the justify content space between. So I'm going to go ahead and take my comment down here. So it's after my semicolon, I move my opening comment tag. And now what we can see is that the individual list items have been, they've been put into position where we have what is called space between. So it's not space around each item, but it's actually space from this item to this item to this item, and this item to this item. But the first item and the last item are at the far edges of their parent in here. Okay, so I'm going to leave that one on, and we're going to play with that. Remember we talked about how CSS can get applied using the last rule wins? Let's go ahead and see that in action right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take off the opening comment tag for justify content flex end. I'm going to drag it down past the semicolon in here. And now what we're going to see is everybody has gone all the way over to the right-hand side. So the space has all been put at the beginning of the units as opposed to in between them. And what's interesting is like when we add in two properties in a row in our CSS that are the same. So this one says justify content and this one says justify content. It's the last rule that wins. Now if I take this one and I bring it back up to the beginning again, it turns off and we go back to the rule that I had specified previously. Let's go ahead and try one more. So I'm going to take this one again, go all the way down past the semicolon, and this one says justify content in the center. So now it's pushed everybody into the middle for right now. So now that everybody is in the middle, let's continue adding our Flexbox CSS. So we're moving down now to a new CSS rule where we are working with list items when they're in an unordered list in the nav. So that's going to be focusing on the individual list items up here. We have the background color in here right now, which you can see is the lighter green. That's the color for the individual list items that we see up in here. What we're going to do right now is I'm going to uncomment the margin on the left of 15 pixels in here, and that's going to help give us a little bit of space between our individual items inside of the nav. So now we can see the individual list items in here. They're still a little awkward looking because their boxes are very tight around them, but we're going to keep working on that. Okay, getting into the flex properties for the list items, the first thing that we're going to start with is something called the flex basis. Now the flex basis is another way of talking about the width of an element. And in this case, we're actually using a percentage, which is kind of new to us. I've mentioned it before, but when we move into responsive design, we need to deal with flexible content. We generally will be using with things like percentages, numbers like percentages, because 15% of something can be really big, but as that parent gets smaller, 15% is going to get smaller at the same rate. So it's essentially a relative measurement as opposed to a fixed measurement, which things like pixels are a fixed measurement. Percentages are a fluid or flexible measurement, a relative measurement. So I turn this into a flex basis of 15%, and it says this is like setting the width of each list item, but using flex speak. It sets each list item to be 15% of the full width of the parent. The unordered list is 100% of the container, making it 960 pixels. So from one edge of the green bar to the other is 960 pixels. And then within that, each one of these list items ends up being 15%. So together we've got 15, 30, 45, 60% of the total bar is being used by our list items right now. Okay. So we've got 40% of that space has been left over, and that is being used in those darker green spaces right now. Okay, so we also want to make the list items flex parents or flex containers themselves. When we do that, then we can deal with the alignment and the positioning of the content within the list items. So it's a little tricky because we're talking about the unordered list as a flex parent of the list items, and then the list items are going to be a flex parent of their content. So we're going to go ahead, we're still in the same CSS rule, we're going to set up these list items to act like flex parents. So when we do that, initially nothing really happens in here, but let's go ahead and center the words inside of those light green boxes. So we're going to say justify the content of the list items. The content is the words, and we're going to say go ahead and center them. There they go, centered. Now we have another property using Flexbox, which is called align items, and we can align them to the top, the bottom, or the center. So we're going to go ahead and do align items to the center, and now each one of our words is put perfectly in the horizontal center and the vertical center of those list items, which is pretty much like the most ridiculously hard thing to do if we weren't using Flexbox. So this looks excellent. This is exactly how we want this to look right now. And some of the cool things is that it didn't matter that the words were different lengths. We were able to get all the boxes to be the same size and deal with our alignment. Looking awesome. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to working with our 3-column layout. With the 3-column layout, it's going to be a little bit hard for you to see the 3 unique regions of content over in the live view. So let me point them out to you. We actually have main starting first. I have prioritized it because it's the most important content to come after the navigation bar. So I put it first in my HTML code because I want to make sure that I'm prioritizing the most important content in my HTML document. Now, because of the power of Flexbox, I can actually deal with my layout in CSS so that I can have this first blue section of content in here. Let me go ahead and get my cursor in here and let's see if we can show you where it is. So I've got the aside selected. This is actually an aside from here to here. And then down below, I actually have a second aside. So this is a separate aside called Did You Know? So the Did You Know aside element in here, which it's taken its sweet time to select. Dreamweaver's having some issues on my side of things. So you can see the box has been selected down here. So this is one aside. This is a separate aside. They are not connected to one another. They're just on top of each other in the code, and so they're on top of each other inside of my visual. And then this itself is main. Main is not the parent of either of these asides. So I literally have the open of main, welcome to Homestead Apothecary and all of its content. Then I close main. Then I start my first aside, which is the upcoming events, and then I close it, and then I start my second aside. So it's a little bit different than what you're used to, and we haven't even really talked about HTML5 element of aside yet. But aside is basically like secondary information that's not necessarily critical to the page, but is helpful and adds more info. So I have these set up as 3 separate containers. Again, main, aside, and aside. And the way that I'm going to work this into my layout is I'm going to have the upcoming events be on the left, blue box. Then I'm going to have my green welcome to the Homestead Apothecary. And then I'm going to have my second blue sort of sidebar in here called put that in your garden. So I'm going to have blue, green, blue by the time I'm done with it. And again, because of Flexbox, we can change the order of our content. So let's go ahead and take a peek. So for this, what we've got in here is 3 column. 3 column is actually a box that is around all 3 of these. So if I come down into my tag selector and I click on the div called 3 column, it should, in a moment, pull this up and we can see that 3 column is a div that actually goes all the way down to the bottom and makes a selection about or around main plus the 2 asides. And that's the way that I'm keeping them together. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to do to that div. Well, the first thing is that we are going to turn that div into the Flex parent. So I'm going to come down in here and I'm going to take the comment off of display flex. I'm going to move that over past my semicolon, and immediately, as soon as we turn that div that was holding everything together into a Flex container or a Flex parent, the children, which were main, aside, aside, all go right into the same row. So that's pretty spectacular. Obviously, it's not done for what we need it to do, but I hope that you can see how quick and easy that is if all we needed was to put 3 things in a row together. So let's keep going. Okay, so now we're talking about what are we going to be doing to main in here. So we're going to start the Flex properties. The first thing that we're going to do with this one is we're going to say, you know what, main, we need you to be second in line. So it has now a property of order and a value of 2. Let's go ahead and turn that on. When I do that, it moves it all the way to the end, which is maybe not what we expected to happen. So let me explain a little bit. Currently right now, everybody had an order of 1. So main right here had an order of 1. Upcoming events had an order of 1. And put that in your garden had an order of 1. That's by default. The order of 1 says stay in the order that you were created, okay? Now, when we moved main to having an order of 2, we didn't actually change anything about upcoming events or put that in your garden, so they're still both at the order of 1. So both of them now have moved to the priority position, and only main has moved down to the position of where a 2 would go. So what we really need to do is we need to also deal with the order for put that in your garden to move it to the other side of main. The next thing I want to do in here is I'm going to turn on a flex basis. Again, remember flex basis is essentially like the width value of an element, but using flex speak. And I've turned it into being 50%, which should be half of the whole container, but it doesn't look right now. Don't worry, this is temporary. That's going to get fixed too. So let's keep going. Now we're going to be looking at upcoming events, which is going to be this blue box right here. Starting the flex properties, I'm going to say, hey, you get a flex basis or a width of 25%. And as soon as I do that, this one becomes much smaller. I also am going to put in here the order of 1. Do you think I really need to do that? Put in the order of 1? I don't actually have to put in the order of 1. But I'm going to do it right now because I am trying to be really clear about how I can shift these into order from left to right. Okay, so that's all I need to do for my upcoming events. You've seen now that it's kind of flip-flop spaces as well. Don't worry, we're getting to it. So now we're working on the did you know. That's did you know right now, put that in your garden. I really want that to go all the way over to the right on the other side of the green main content. So let's get started. I am going to do a few things in here. One is I want it to also be 25%, 25%, 25%, 50%. Put them all together, we're at 100%. Now I'm going to go ahead and set its order to 3, and now it has moved all the way to the end. So at this point, I have my 3-column layout. That was very easy. They're all the same height, which is not something we would get with a float-based layout. I was able to put in my specific widths using Flex properties and change the order of my content. So even though main started first in my document, it now presents as being middle on the page. Okay, let's go ahead and move down to the next unit of content in here. So right now I have a gallery, a grid gallery, and inside of it I have individual images. Now this is going to get a little bit trickier if you have an image with text that goes with it, because each image with text needs to be put into its own box to keep those things together. But for this one right here, it should give you an idea about how simple this could be. So I've got my grid gallery. I have individual images inside of it. And what my goal is here is to get them to all tile out into a beautiful grid very easily. So for the grid gallery itself, I have both a grid gallery and a grid container. I'm going to flop into my HTML code for a moment just so I can give you an idea about what that looks like. So give it a second, and then I'm going to go down here. That's the 3 columns that we just worked on. And then I want to show you my grid gallery. So what I have right here is I have the section with the ID of grid gallery, and you can see it selected over here. It's this really big green box that I have created. It's very tall because of how many images I put inside of it. The H1 is actually inside of the grid gallery. So we see it up here at the top. Now after that, what we have is I actually have a box inside of it called the grid container. Notice the grid container only holds together the items that I want to use Flexbox with. So I don't really want the H1 to become a flex item, because otherwise it would make it have its own column and then the images would sit next to it. I actually don't want it to flex at all. I want it to remain above the items that will flex. So when the gallery flexes out and I end up with those in a grid, I want the H1 to not have been affected by that. I want it to remain at the top. So I had to put a separate box inside, and I use that as a div because it's not a meaningful grouping. The meaningful grouping is really the grid gallery. This is really just there so that I can use my CSS. And then inside of each one of these, I have a div with an image inside of it. Why did I put a div there with an image inside? Well, I'll tell you. Because you would need to have a div here if you wanted to have an image with text and have it flex out. So I'm going to go ahead and just add a little bit of text into this one. I'm going to add in here an H2, and I will say T1. I'm going to copy this H2, and I'm only going to do it for my first row, but I just want you to be able to see what this might look like if you were going to actually put in text with an image, because you do really need to have them together in a box like a div to keep them as a unit. So now I've got my image and my text, and they themselves are inside of their own box. Let's go ahead and see if we can pull that up. Take your sweet time, Dreamweaver. Dreamweaver's no fast for me. No faster for me here. Okay, so let's see. Working on it. There we go. Okay, so here is the box called Grid Child, and the Grid Child now has my image in it and my text content in it. Now this is really important. Like I said, if I want to keep image and text, anything more than just one item, like just the image or just the text, you're going to need to put them into a box to group them. So let's say that I did that same thing. I'm going to replace the next 2 divs in here so that we can try that and see what the effect is. So I'm going to go ahead and I will just replace that one. Excuse me. You don't need to do this on your own, by the way. It's enough for you just to kind of see what it is that I'm doing in here as an example for you. Okay, so now I have 3 that are the grid child with both text and image, and we'll go ahead and continue forward with just those so you can see the difference in here. So again, the section in here, which is the whole green, is the grid gallery, and then I have the grid container, which is set within it, and that holds together all of the images and all of these divs with a class of grid child. The first 3 I've modified in order to give them with their text and their image content, and the last ones are just images inside of divs. So I'm going to pop back over into our CSS file so we can see this get shaped. Okay, so the grid gallery, really nothing is happening with this one right now in terms of Flexbox, but the grid container in here is our Flex parent. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on as a display of Flex, and immediately you can see what happens with it. So we see the image and text for the first 3, and then we see that all of them are in a single row and they have gone way off the page in here. So they have essentially kind of spilled out of the width of our container. We're going to have to deal with that because that is not what we want. So what we need to do is we're going to use a special property called Flex Wrap. Again, it's Flex specific. So what wrapping means is when I get to the end of the space, I need to go down to the next line. And then when I get to the end of the space again, I need to go down to the next line. Flexbox doesn't do that by default. If the things that have been flexed are wider than the container or the parent that they live in, they will just keep going. So what we're doing instead is we are saying, hey, if you are the Flex parent, you need to allow the children to wrap within you. So we just said Flex Wrap Wrap. The default is Flex Wrap No Wrap, which is just in there and you don't see it like all the other default. So we're kind of counteracting that right now. And then the last thing that we want to do in here is we're going to put some space in between each one of these. So now instead of having this, I'm going to go ahead and shrink this over. Instead of having our boxes go all the way out, they're now wrapping. And there was a little bit of extra space left over because when you added up the width of each one of these images in here, they left a little bit of extra space. When I said space between, then what happened in here was that the space was allowed to, let me go ahead, justify content, the space between, distributed that extra space in between the individual little grid child boxes in here. Okay, and then that's actually the only thing I had to do. Isn't that easy? So take a peek at this in here right now, because what you should notice again is that the text has stayed with the images. You know what could be really interesting in here is if we were to play around again with the content getting centered horizontally, right? So we could start to work with and manipulate the content inside of our captions and start to move that around too. A couple of other things I wanted to point out to you right now. One of them is that you can mix and match Flexbox with other regular CSS properties. So just because I'm using Flexbox for the layout doesn't mean that I can't come back and say that I want H2s inside of grid child to be centered. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you that right now. So I'm going to pop back over here. I'm going to turn off my code. Turn off my code by going into live view. Give my computer a second to deal with itself. And then over inside of my CSS designer, let me see if I can get it a little bit wider. Okay, so in here right now, here's grid child. When I click on Grid Child right now, I can see in here that I've got some of the margins dealt with. Inside of my grid container, I can see that under the More category, I actually have the flex wrap of wrap and the justify content of space between in here. This is kind of interesting for you to see because the Flexbox properties are not found inside of the CSS Designer panel. So we either have to type them in, hand code them into the code document ourselves, or we have to know exactly which flex properties and values we want. We can add them through the More section of our CSS Designer. Let me go ahead and turn this off of Show Set. So when I'm off of Show Set, and we have layout, text, border, background, and more. More is where we can go, where we can add properties. So let's say that I'm working on the grid container and I wanted to say something like flex, and then I can start to see in here that I have a bunch of options. So it's like flex what? So maybe I say, oh, I want flex direction. And let's say that I go, oh, I'd like it to be in a row reverse. So this is how I can add flex properties through Dreamweaver. But again, in just sort of like our regular CSS properties that we see throughout the CSS Designer, you're not going to see flex. I can set things like the display to flex, and I can do that just by typing in here flex. Now, any of the other flex properties that I want, though, I'm going to have to come back in here into the More and add them in manually. So I don't want the row reverse. I'm going to go ahead and take that off. So just as a heads up in here, you'll probably need to have one of those resources that you have been introduced to in our module for Flexbox available to you when you are trying to practice with Flexbox for your own website, so that you can put the property in here and put the value. And let's go ahead and take a look at this online. Okay, so I hope that you can see this right now. What we have currently is we've got our navigation bar at the top. We've got our sidebar, which is an aside, main, and then aside in our 3-column layout. And then here's our grid gallery, where we made the flex parent is a div that goes around all of these. And then inside we have the grid child, which are all flexed out. Hope you enjoyed that. Please go ahead and give it a shot. Talk to you soon. Bye.